Hello, everybody. I am John Allen, the editor of Crux, and your host here on Last Week in the Church. This is the show where we sort of take some stale leftover headlines from the past week, but we serve them up piping hot and delicious, just as if they're fresh and right off the skillet. Here's what we've got for you this week. First, Supersizing the Synod. Pope Francis has decided that the Synod on Synodality won't just be a one-off event next October, but is actually going to unfold in two stages, one meeting next October, then an additional year of reflection, and then a final synod in October 2024. We'll explain why some people are now referring to this as Pope Francis's very own Vatican II. Next, bumps in the road to Bahrain. Pope Francis is going to be going to the Muslim nation of Bahrain November 3rd through the 6th for a celebration of what was designed to be interfaith harmony, but this trip may actually also expose some interfaith tensions. We'll explain what's going on there. Third, death comes for the Archbishop. Archbishop Joseph Fiorenza of Houston passed away last month at the age of 91. We'll explain why his legacy should not be forgotten, and not only is it not dead, it's not even past. It is very much part of Houston's present. Fourth, defending the disabled. One of America's best-known Catholic bishops gears up for a major push on behalf of people with Down syndrome and other cognitive and developmental disabilities. We'll explain what's happening there. And then finally, the happenstance of hope. Why a few random moments from the last couple of weeks add up to a case for hope, despite it all, for the present and future of the Catholic Church. All that and more is waiting for you this week on this edition of Last Week in the Church, so please stick around. All right, everybody, happy Tuesday to you. Thank you for being with us on Last Week in the Church. As you know, the last couple of weeks we were on the road, but now we are back safely ensconced in our professional-grade studio here in Rome. I'm going to be off next week, not sure about the week after that. We will keep you posted, but in any event, I'm here right now. So here's what we've got for you. We begin with Supersizing the Synod. So, in his traditional noontime Angelus address on Sunday, Pope Francis announced that his upcoming Synod on Synodality, which has long sort of loomed as a peak moment in this papacy, is actually going to be at least two big moments. So we've already had the diocesan phase of consultations. We are now basically finished with the national level, where bishops' conferences are sifting through what they heard from the diocese and filing their reports. We are entering the continental phase of consultation, where continental-level assemblies of bishops are going to pour through all of this and try to synthesize it. Now, all of this was originally designed to build toward a Synod of Bishops next October, that is October 2023, which would take all of the input that had been gathered in these earlier phases and then submit some recommendations to the Pope. Well, now, as Pope Francis announced on Sunday, instead of that, there will still be this synod next October, but that's not going to be the culminating moment. Instead, what's going to happen is that the bishops and other participants in the synod will take a kind of first stab at a synthesis, and then that is going to be submitted for further reflection, analysis, pondering, rumination, cogitation, whatever, for another year. And then, presumably involving the whole Catholic community once again in some fashion. And then there will be a final meeting of the Synod in October 2024. And presumably, at that point, recommendations for action of some kind would be placed in front of Pope Francis. Now, I want to say, when I heard this on Sunday, my first reaction was, this is really Pope Francis's Vatican II. I mean, the Pope is not going to call an ecumenical council. Nevertheless, his entire papacy, in many ways, has been animated by, as he sees it, the spirit of Vatican II, trying to revive that spirit of collegiality, consultation, or synodality in the life of the church. And since he's never going to have his own ecumenical council, this synod on synodality is probably as close as he's going to come. And, I am happy to say, apparently, am not the only person having that thought. My wife, Elise, who is much more adroit on social media than I am, tells me that in the immediate aftermath of this announcement, others on social media were making this observation as well. I do want to emphasize, I reached it independent of all of that. It was simply a first blush gut level reaction. But in any event, I think in some ways the comparison is apt. Pope Francis, I think it is clear from the way he has handled this process from the beginning, believes that a core element of his legacy, the imprint, if you like, that he is trying to leave upon the Catholic Church, is this notion of synodality. Now, that is notoriously difficult to define, but in some broad sense, it means a collaborative, consultative approach to decision-making about the life and mission of the Church that involves the hierarchy, the regular clergy, religious, and laity, meaning everybody. And, exactly what that is going to lead to is very difficult to say at this stage. If you look at the input that has been gathered to date, that is, the syntheses that have been put together by bishops' conferences in various parts of the world, and in some cases released, in other cases not, at the big picture level, it seems to speak to a desire to reach out especially to populations in the church that have traditionally felt marginalized, whether that is the laity vis-a-vis the clergy, whether that is divorced and remarried Catholics, whether that is LGBTQ plus Catholics, whoever it may be, migrants, refugees. In any event, people who perceive themselves to be on the margins, there is this clear desire, based on these reports, to try to build a church that does a better job of reaching out and gathering those people in. Now, it should be said, this process has come in for some criticism. Some have noted relatively low levels of participation. In the United States, for instance, the number is around 700,000 Catholics who either took part in a physical listening session or who at least completed an online questionnaire. Now, we've got a Catholic population in the United States close to 70 million, so we're talking about, at best, maybe 10% of the country's Catholics who actually participated, and frankly, the numbers in the United States are probably higher than in many other places. And so some would say, how consultative is this really? Or are we just hearing from the same circle of kind of activist, engaged Catholics who kind of always pipe up about issues in the church? Others are worried about where all this may lead. They would look at the synodal path currently underway in Germany, which conservatives in particular believe is floating some proposals that, regarding blessing same-sex unions and things like that, that the conservatives would say, at least, are clearly at odds with Orthodox Church teaching. The former head of the Vatican's doctrinal office, German Cardinal Gerhard Müller, recently had some negative things to say about this entire exercise, saying it's an effort to sort of hijack the church. We don't yet know what the end game here is. We don't yet know if Pope Francis has specific conclusions in mind he hopes this exercise will reach. I think one thing is safe to say, however, which is, although God only knows what will happen, at least in Pope Francis's mind, I don't think he sees his papacy ending before October 2024. I think it's fairly clear that he would like to bring this plane in for a landing before he is done. As ever, we shall see. All right, second up this week, bumps in the road to Bahrain. So the Vatican recently announced the dates for Pope Francis's long talked about, long planned trip to Bahrain. He's going to be there November 3rd through the 6th. And this is to take part in an interfaith gathering that is taking place under the auspices of the government in Bahrain. In particular, obviously, focusing on dialogue between Islam and the other great religions of the world, with the Pope's participation, especially Christianity. And there is a fair bit to celebrate in Bahrain. The king there, King Hassan al-Khalifi, a few years ago, announced that he was going to be donating land, his personally owned land, for the construction of a new Catholic basilica. I believe it is the largest Catholic basilica opened on the Arabian Peninsula since the era of the Islamic conquest. And this was obviously styled as a great gesture of religious tolerance. However, after the Vatican's announcement, an activist group in the United States, which promotes human rights and democracy in Bahrain, issued a statement asking the Pope either to cancel his trip or, if he was determined to go ahead with it, while he is in Bahrain, to sort of lodge a public protest about what this activist group sees as the decidedly mixed record of the monarchy in Bahrain when it comes to religious freedom, and in particular, perceived mistreatment of the Shia Muslim minority in Bahrain. It's quite clear that the government in Bahrain is very sensitive to this kind of criticism. One way we at Crux know that is that after my wife Elise, our lead Vatican correspondent, wrote up a very straightforward piece about this statement from the activist group, which was, in essence, quoting the U.S. State Department's own annual report on international religious freedom about issues in Bahrain, she got a very vigorous protest from someone who works, I guess, on communications for the government, complaining that this is a wild misrepresentation of the reality and that, in fact, Bahrain is fully committed to pluralism, democracy, apple pie, and everything good. So, we will see how this plays out, but it seems clear that Pope Francis wants to make this trip to celebrate interreligious harmony, but it may well be that the nature of the reality of the situation is that both in the run-up to the trip and while he's on the ground, he's also going to have to confront some challenges to that desired sort of universe of interfaith harmony. Again, we will have full coverage of all of this on the Crux site. All right, third, death comes from the Archbishop. So last month, the retired Archbishop of Houston, Archbishop Joseph Fiorenza, who led the Archdiocese of Galveston-Houston for 22 years, and during some of that time also served as president of the U.S. Bishops' Conference from 1998 to 2001. Archbishop Fiorenza died at the age of 91. Now, I was just in Houston this past week. I spoke at the annual Archdiocesan Red Mass for judges and lawyers, and I can tell you that our Archbishop Joseph Fiorenza was, and remains even in death, a deeply beloved figure in Houston. He was sort of seen as the quintessential good pastor. During the course of his long career, Archbishop Fiorenza was part of what is known in Houston as the Three Amigos. These were three religious leaders, a Baptist minister, a Jewish rabbi, and the Catholic Archbishop, who stood together on a wide variety of social justice and public interest issues. They were founding members of Houston's Coalition for the Homeless. It was because of them that Houston created a public defender's office in 2011. They stood in defense of racial justice, in defense of immigrants, and just pretty much anything you can imagine. And they were very much a local institution. Now, again, having been in Houston, taken the temperature, I can tell you that there is a real effort there to preserve and pass on the legacy of Archbishop Joseph Fiorenza. And one of the protagonists in that effort is the current Cardinal Archbishop of Houston, Cardinal Daniel DiNardo. Now, part of what makes this so cool is that in terms of church politics, I think most people would say that Fiorenza was, a little bit of a Vatican II liberal, and DiNardo is a little bit more of a John Paul II conservative. However, when you listen to DiNardo talk about Fiorenza and you just watch the way that those two men interacted over the last years of Fiorenza's life, it is clear that whatever political differences there may be are incredibly minor, and what was much more profound was a deep respect that the two men shared for one another and a sense of kind of common cause as servants of the church. Archbishop Fiorenza did everything he could to support Cardinal DiNardo once he took over, and in turn, Cardinal DiNardo has been incredibly respectful of Archbishop Fiorenza, both in life and in death. I mean, I watched him preside over that Red Mass, and he made a point of saying that the cathedral in which the Mass was celebrated was Joe Fiorenza's house, because he's, in effect, the prelate under whom it was built. And I just think that speaks volumes about the inner reality of the Catholic Church. Sometimes we can become so consumed by perceptions of our differences that we fail to see these deeper bonds of unity that knit us together. And so, all I can say regarding Archbishop Fiorenza, who I met back in the late 90s when he was president of the Bishops' Conference, and he came over to Rome once a year for these meetings that the officers of the conference have with Vatican officials. And I was deeply impressed by his innate Sicilian skepticism of Rome. He was the son of Sicilian immigrants to the United States, and like many Sicilians, he sort of looks at Rome as an occupying foreign power that's not to be trusted, which meant that, he didn't sing Hosanna every time the Vatican, zigged to the left or the right, but he saw it through a critical lens, and appropriately so, in my experience. He was a great pastor and a great man. All I can say of him is requiescat in pace, and of the ecclesial climate that he and Cardinal DiNardo represented in Houston. I just think it's a model for the rest of us, and good on both of you. All right, fourth this week, defending the disabled. So pretty much, if you are an American Catholic, you have doubtless heard the name Bishop Robert Barron. Barron, for several years, was an auxiliary bishop of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. He is now the diocesan bishop of Winona and Rochester in Minnesota. But what he is better known for, of course, is his own media work. I mean, his fabled Catholicism series and his ministry, Word on Fire, that he founded in 2000 to play a lead role in the new evangelization, especially the evangelization of digital media. So he is known as a kind of high-tech digital media entrepreneur and one of the most arguably the single most successful bishop evangelist in the English language, and one of the most prominent throughout the world. But he's taking on a new project. The Word on Fire Institute, which is part of his Word on Fire ministry, it exists to sponsor not only scholarly work on evangelization, but also popular activity too, webinars and in-person events and books and video productions and so on. It is creating a new fellowship. It's to be called the Venerable Jérôme Lejeune Fellowship, named in honor of a French pediatrician and geneticist who was the researcher who was responsible for identifying the genetic marker that is linked to Down syndrome. He was a tireless advocate for people with Down and with other disabilities. He was also an ardent Catholic and is currently a candidate for sainthood. Now, before I go any further, just in the interest of full disclosure, I need to acknowledge I am also an institute or a fellow of the Word on Fire Institute. I hold the St. Francis de Sales Fellowship for Media and Communication, so I can't pretend to complete objectivity here, but let me just say anyway that it strikes me as enormously important that Bishop Barron and Word on Fire are making this effort now, the data is abundantly clear about the impact of the rise of almost mandatory but near universal prenatal testing for pregnant women beginning in the 2000s. In most parts of the developed world these days anyway, prenatal testing is now just a routine part of prenatal care, and that will inform pregnant women and their partners about the genetic profile of the child that they are preparing to have. And we know from abundant data that when pregnant women are informed that their child has a genetic marker for Down syndrome or for other developmental disabilities, the tendency is for those unborn children to be aborted. Iceland is sort of the emblematic case here. Prenatal testing became very common there in the early 2000s, and the abortion rate for unborn children identified with Down syndrome is nearly 100%. A few years ago, this led Atlantic Magazine to run a provocative cover story titled "The Last Children of Down Syndrome," because the idea was essentially they're being aborted out of existence. Now, Bishop Barron refers to this as a hidden genocide, has called it an exercise in eugenics, and sees part of the role of this new fellowship as becoming an advocate on behalf of people with Down syndrome and with other disabilities. What he wants is to hire a fellow, an initial fellow, and that one of their first responsibilities will be to identify another person who has Down syndrome or some other cognitive or developmental disability who would become the second Lejeune Fellow of the Word on Fire Institute. He sees this as a kind of premier pro-life crusade. That is, he sees the people with these disabilities as essentially being targeted for death largely because they are not perceived as valuable, as constructive members of the human community. And if he thinks if the church's pro-life commitment is to mean anything, it should mean defense of these vulnerable individuals. Now, as ever, it's hard to say what kind of impact this is going to have over the long term. I will say this, however, that the track record of Bishop Barron and Word on Fire is that when they get serious about something, they're really serious about it. And they have a pretty big media cannon out of which to fire their messages. So, we'll see. It will be very interesting to see how this develops. Obviously, we will continue to cover it at Crux. Finally this week, the happenstance of hope. So, over the last couple of weeks, my wife and I took a kind of whirlwind tour of the United States. We spent a few days in Denver visiting her family there. I was then in rural western Kansas, a place called Hays, to collect an Alumni Achievement Award from my alma mater, Fort Hays State University. And if you're wondering how in the hell did I get an award like that, believe me, so am I. But that's a conversation for another day. In any event, they saw fit to give it to me. I'm very grateful. Then we were in Houston for the Red Mass that I mentioned earlier, then back in Denver for a little while, and then back to the States. Now, so here are just some random things that happened along the way. So while we were in Denver last Sunday, we attended Mass at Holy Name Parish. Now, just a kind of regular parish in Denver, but I am telling you, the 10:30 a.m. Sunday liturgy was packed. I mean, I didn't do a head count, but there had to be something like 200, at least, people there. Striking thing, many of them families with lots of little kids. I mean, at some point, I didn't know if I was at a Catholic Mass or like a day school because there were so many kids squawking. But, it was a very positive thing, and it spoke of life and dynamism and so on. Then we were at the Red Mass in Houston, which was held at 6:15 on a Monday. And may I point out that this was a Monday when the Houston Astros, the local baseball team, which is a juggernaut, the most popular sports franchise in Houston by some order of magnitude, was playing a playoff game against the Seattle Mariners. And everybody who came to that Mass had to leave before the ninth inning in that playoff game, which means to a person, they all missed Jordan Alvarez's dramatic walk-off 3-run home run in the bottom of the ninth to win the game for the Astros. And again, there were at least 200 people in the church, and these are lawyers and judges, white-collar types who, it's not like they don't have other things to do with their time, right? Then, you know what I skipped over about when we were in Holy Name in Denver? Let me also say that after the Mass, as we were standing around, I ran into a couple of young Capuchins. Of course, I was educated by the Capuchins back in the day. These are young men. I want to give a shout out to them, brothers Charbel and Brian. One's American, one's Nigerian, who have decided, despite everything, to give their lives to prepare to become Catholic priests and to serve the people of God. All right, so Denver, Houston. Then we're back in Rome this past Sunday. We go to Mass at our little local parish, Maria Regina Apostoli, Mary Queen of the Apostles. And it wasn't a huge turnout at the 9 a.m. Mass. Maybe 40 people were there. But the thing that struck me is that, despite the relatively low numbers, and this is probably a church that could accommodate 200 people without breaking a sweat, but despite the turnout, the altar was perfectly appointed, the preparations were flawless, and our pastor, Don Nicola Gallucci, gave one of his typically carefully crafted, thoughtful, spiritually insightful homilies, as if to make the point that ultimately size doesn't really matter. So what am I trying to say here? What I'm saying is this. We are all wearily familiar with the data about the decline of institutional religion generally and the Catholic Church in particular, especially in the developed West. We know that Mass attendance rates are down. We know that vocations to the priesthood and religious life are down. We know the reality of political division, wrangling, and infighting within the Catholic community. We know that young people in particular are likely to be resistant to the lure of any form of institutional spirituality, and that there are great struggles with handing on the faith to the next generation. We know all of that. And it's all real, okay? But my experience over the last 2 weeks nevertheless tells me that if you have eyes to see, there is also a powerful case for hope about the prospects of the Catholic Church in our time. Because despite all those worrying trends, there is real life. And you know what? Here's my conviction. I don't know about you, but when I went to school, we had one of those Rand McNally timelines of world history on the wall of my grade school classroom that began with the Neanderthals and Cro-Magnon man, right? And ended usually somewhere around the Vietnam War, because that was about the time that I guess our school district ran out of money to buy new maps. Anyway, my point is, if you were to be blindfolded, right, and then just throw a dart at random at that timeline, whenever it landed, you probably could have made a case for despair, and you probably could have made a case for hope. It's just a question of what you choose to focus on. And I would say the same thing about the state of the Catholic Church in the early 21st century. Is there a truckload of stuff to be worried about? Of course there is. And we shouldn't be blind to that. But here's the thing. If you just drop in, put boots on the ground in parishes and religious communities and lay movements and other centers of Catholic life, both in the United States and around the world, if you want to find it, you are going to find a lot of reasons to feel hopeful too about Catholic fortunes in our time. And, maybe once in a while, rather than focusing on the bleak, depressing, and alarming trends in church life, that case for hope ought to have a claim in our imaginations as well. All right, that is our show for this week. Thank you so much for being with us. A reminder, I will not be here next week. Not quite sure about the week after that, but we will keep you posted on the Crux site. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, have a fantastic and blessed, fortnight, I guess, and we will talk to you again soon.